Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Filter, a podcast about digital art, new media, and video games. Today, I'm here talking with Darius Kazemi. Hi, Darius.
Hey,
So Darius, on his website, it says, "I make bots and generators and other weird internet stuff." Um, and also, I know of you through video game stuff, which you used to do more of.
yeah.
And then you wrote a piece/talk called "Fuck Video Games," which we can talk about. But I guess you're also my first guest on here who's actually lives in Portland, which is kind of funny.
I guess Portland is kind of funny.
um, but yeah, so can you talk a little bit about your background and how you got into the stuff that you're into now and sort of the route that you took?
Yeah, sure. So I guess my to describe my background, I might have to go back to at least when I was in like a kid, and I was just always I was one of those kids I was fortunate enough to be around computers, and I found them fascinating, and so I was by the time I was like 9 or 10 years old, I was programming very simple like choose your own adventure games in QBasic and that kind of thing. So just a text prompt and just like little games about the kids in my fifth grade class and that kind of thing. Um, and then I kept at programming as a hobby, and I took some programming classes in high school, but I never expected to do that kind of thing in particular as a job. Like I didn't go to college for computer programming. I actually went for electrical engineering. When I was in high school, I was really into, I mean, I still am really into music and like synthesizers and amplifiers and effects and things like that. And so I wanted to be a digital signal processing engineer. Like I wanted to work with audio electronics. And so when I was in high school, I was building amplifiers and effects, and I built a drum machine and uh, a bunch of other stuff just from scratch. And so that was like my big technical interest in high school. And then but I was also building other weird stuff too. Like I remember when I discovered, because I was building my own drum machine, I discovered that I could uh, route the digital like the outs, like basically do feedback but digitally. So I would route some of the address buses back, the data buses back into the address buses, and like cause the samples to skip and stutter and that sort of thing on the drum machine. Um, and so I was definitely like playing around with that sort of thing, and I built a thing once that used a voice synthesizer to call Papa John's and order pizza on Fridays for my lab.
That's like one of
Uh,
those jukebox online internet jukebox things, except cooler. Like the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing, where people would call
oh yeah,
like
yeah,
pizza places and try and order through
right,
kindergarten cop samples.
yeah, and so that was like that was high school for me. So I went to school for electrical engineering, and I did get a degree in that. But while I was in school, there was also a game development club there, and I had been interested in video games since I was a kid too. It was like probably my main hobby besides reading was playing video games, and in high school, I actually ran a review website called classicgames.org, and me and my friend Kevin started that website, and we
That
would just
sounds that sounds very official. I think at that time I might have even read that website, but if I like looked at it, I would have been like, "Oh, this is very official because it's
yeah,
called Classic Games."
we were really excited to get the classicgames.org
Yeah.
domain, um, and and that was a really fun project too. Like this would have been in 1990. No, we started the website in 2000 or 1999, and so I was in high school, almost graduated at that point, and And this was like a nostalgia website but we were like 16-year-olds being nostalgic for games that we played when we were 11.
I mean me and my brother both collected 8-bit NES Nintendo like games when I think I was like 13 and he was like 50. Yeah, I was like 12 and he was like 15 or something. And he even had a website. Like we went online. And during that time, there were a lot of like retro Nintendo and retro other stuff too. Because it wasn't like, quote unquote retro wasn't really mainstream yet. But
Yeah.
there were a lot of communities. And yeah, I guess for the Nintendo thing, it was like it was because we never owned we owned a Nintendo, but we didn't get one until like 1994 or something. But it is like it says something about games that like you have to make a classic games website for things that came out 5 years ago. But that's how games are. Like people forget about stuff so quickly.
Yeah, and so we covered we limited it strictly to DOS shareware. That was like our that was what we wanted to talk about was DOS shareware games, not the full versions of the games, because the full versions of the games we probably didn't play anyway. We were always just downloading stuff from BBSs and getting or we would get those catalogs in the mail where you could buy
Like
share
the
episodes.
Apogee catalog,
Yeah, although I never was cool enough to get the Apogee catalog. I think the
because
one
I
I
had
got.
that one.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I had like a big third-party one. I want to say I looked it up years ago, and I forget the name of it now. It was like the software something, not catalog, but it was.
I bet there was some weird stuff on there though.
There was, yeah, it was. So sort of at the front, they had all the stuff from like Apogee and Epic and id, but then as you got like towards the back, you started to see some of like your Bible simulator stuff and things like that. Um, and we had a lot of love for all that stuff from like the very polished, stuff like Doom, all the way to random Bible simulator. Um, and so we did DOS shareware games uh, and also it was my first experience doing public writing on the internet. Writing these reviews was really the first time, other than like posting to Usenet news groups. It was the first time I'd ever really done any kind of like writing to speak of on the web. Um, and I got to say, going back and, the site's been down forever, but it's on the Internet Archive. And going back and reading some of my stuff, I'm like, oh, this is definitely written by a teenager, but it's not that embarrassing. I actually like some of the stuff that I wrote there, and I still make myself laugh at times. Um, but there was definitely we definitely liked some of the weird games on there, and we made sure to publish both a list of like highest rated games because we had like a numerical ranking, of course, but we also had our lowest rated games too, and those were very popular as well. It was also my first time interacting with professional game developers. Because we would occasionally contact the author, like we contacted David Gray, who wrote David P. Gray, who wrote the Hugo's House of Horror games.
Oh, okay.
And so we published an interview with him. Um,
A lot of those people probably haven't been interviewed very much at all.
no, yeah, that interview was one of the only existing interviews with him. And then there was this guy, which was it was amazing. It's this guy, Shannon Larat, who we interviewed him because he made our lowest rated game ever, or at least at the time. It was called Alien Worlds, and it was clearly written by him when he was like 12 years old or 13. And we contacted him when he was in his early 20s, and he was like, "Yeah, wow, I can't believe you found this game, and like I did write it when I was 12, and thanks for interviewing me about it." But it was funny because when we contacted him, he was actually already internet famous because he ran BME Zine. I don't know if you're familiar with BME Zine. It was like maybe still is the big body modification website, like
Wow.
for people who like, get forked tongues and like, embed stuff in their face and things like that, like major sort of surgical body modification. So he's like a celebrity in that community. But when he was 12, he made this really bad game called Alien Worlds, and we
Someone should make a list of all the people who either their careers started out in games and then they went on to do something completely different, or they like did it when they were young and then they, are popular or famous in a completely different like
yeah.
realm or community. Because there's a lot of people like that.
Yeah. And so, but so classicgames.org was like a fun, interesting experience. And that was also during a time on the internet in 1999 where we would get like 10 cents every time someone clicked on a banner and, 1 cent every 10 people who looked at a banner or something like that. So, we had very modest traffic, but we ended up making something like, I don't know, 50, $60 a month off of it, which for a couple of 16-year-olds in 1999 was like, at least I had like enough money to like buy a new video game once a month.
Yeah,
So
that would have been mind blowing to me to even just make any money off the internet at that time.
yeah, yeah. But so I did that, and then in college I was going there for electrical engineering, but we had this was at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts, and there was a game development club there, and the club was interesting to me because I liked video games and had always wanted to make them, and so I joined this club, and I got really into it. I started out doing more electronic stuff, so I was building like little displays and like joysticks and stuff like that, but then I started getting into I started programming games for the Game Boy Advance, which was actually like a contemporary console at the time. And I never finished anything, but it was just fun to even just be able to get a sprite to move around on the screen. And then when I was 19, I started reading Game Developer Magazine. And Game Developer Magazine.
Does that still exist?
No, they went out of they discontinued the magazine like last year, I think.
Okay.
But Game Developer, I would read that, and I would devour it. In fact, I think at the time it might have. I forget. This would have been in 2002, or this would have been late 2002. I'm not 100% sure, but I know at least in the first couple of years I started reading it. That was when I first knew who John Blow was, because he was writing a column. Like he was kind of a well-known columnist for Game Developer Magazine, writing their technology column.
John Blow, of course, everyone's favorite designer of Braid and The Witness.
Exactly.
So everyone's favorite curmudgeon or something. I don't even know if curmudgeon is accurate, but
yeah, and because capitalism, Game Developer Magazine was owned by the same company that runs the Game Developers Conference. And so, I bought a subscription to the magazine, and then because I bought a subscription to that, I got, advertising for the conference. And I was like, oh, this seems kind of interesting. I kind of like want to go to this. And I asked my parents about it because, I was like 19, and I was like, it's professional development. I could go and like, learn, job tech stuff. And they were like, thankfully, we had the money, and my dad was like, yeah, professional development, great. So he paid for me to like fly out there and get a ticket and stuff, which is not, it's extremely expensive. So he was definitely like, well, this is an investment in your future.
I've never paid for a pass at the Game Developers Conference.
Yeah.
I've always gotten it through something.
Yeah, when I didn't get it through my dad, I got it through work or because I was speaking. Yeah. And so I went to GDC in 2003, and that was like a life-changing experience for me. I met a lot of people who like I don't agree with or talk to very much anymore. But at the time, I mean, and they're good folks, and we've just sort of like diverged in sort of both aesthetic and political opinions.
That's
years,
a
you know.
yeah. That was a really weird era for games. Like,
It was. Oh, I could talk at length about what it was like at the time, especially in 2003, because 1999, 2000, 2001 was when all of the like small to mid-sized independent game developers were shutting down.
mhm.
Like Looking Glass closed down, and I
the
think
the most
2000,
famous
2001.
yeah, the most famous one is like Ion Storm.
Right. Ion Storm was around until 2003, but then shut down, I think, in 2003 or 2000.
Oh, I think the Dallas office shut down
Oh,
earlier.
Dallas shut down earlier. Yeah, Austin stuck around until like 2003 to release Deus Ex 2.
Right.
Um, but
Because that's something that I would have been familiar with at the time, like the whole Ion Storm thing, because it was all over the place. Like
right,
if
because it
you
was
were
John
building,
Romero's like,
yeah,
big white whale thing. Um, yeah, and so, but everything was shutting down. I mean, we might talk about this. One of the projects that I did was a book for Boss Fight Books on the game Jagged Alliance 2 by Surtech Games, and Surtech shut down in 2001 or 2000 as well. Looking Glass, Ion Storm, and a bunch of other studios, like really, well-known sort of big name studios that were sort of the independent ones, not owned by publishers, were either shut down or purchased. Like that was around the time that Maxis was bought by EA, along with their Sims title and SimCity and all that stuff. And so and it was a really bad time for innovation because digital distribution hadn't really taken off yet. Of course, it had existed for a long time. I mean, I ran a freaking DOS shareware game website. We were doing digital distribution over BBSs, in the 80s and 90s. But digital distribution as we know it, Steam didn't exist until 2003, and third-party games were not sold on Steam until 2005. Um, so, so it's really, it was a really bad time for anything independent or innovative. The way I like to describe it is, I believe it was in 2003, things were so bad that people were forced to call Beyond Good and Evil by Ubisoft like a really fascinating, amazing game.
people still love that game.
I
I
know, but it doesn't hold up, and
Yeah.
it's nostalgia for how fresh it felt at the time, and it only felt fresh at the time, I believe, because everything else was terrible. It was just horrible.
Yeah.
Like in 2003, 2004, the only game anybody ever really talked about was Deus Ex, like the first Deus Ex, because that was like the only thing people could point to that was remotely, interesting to anyone.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, and at the time, I mean, in Japan, the game industry is doing pretty well. Like, there's the Metal Gear Solid games and
Oh yeah, they would
all
talk
that
about
stuff.
Japanese games and stuff, but at least in 2003 there was no Japanese presence at GDC
Yeah.
at all.
Well, GDC hadn't become like a centralized, as much of a centralized event maybe as it's considered now. I don't
Yeah, I
know
mean,
if it
it
is
was
considered that.
it was 10,000 people in 2003, so it was a pretty big event, but it's like 20,000 now, so it's like or somewhere in that ballpark. Actually, no, I'm sorry, it was like 5,000 or 6,000 people back then. Yeah, so it was a much smaller event, although it was still very, very large. Um, but yeah, so yeah, 2003 was a weird time for games, and there were two things that really stood out to me when I went to, I guess three things that really stood out to me when I went to GDC that year. So I was 19, very impressionable, and very excited to be there and meet people, and I met some great people. They're amazing people who go to GDC every year. They still do. Um, and I was just impressed with the sort of caliber and quality of thinkers that I ran into. Like everyone was interested in pushing forward the state of the art. It was exciting for me. And what was especially exciting was the experimental gameplay workshop and it was called the workshop back then. Now it's called the sessions, I think. But and that was something where they showed what would be today considered like indie games, or small experiments. So they would show like, oh, here's a build of a game that we never released, but it had this feature that didn't make the cut, but we thought it was an interesting feature, so we're going to show you now. Um, so they would show stuff like that, or they would find weird games from Japan that hadn't been localized yet, and then show this has this interesting mechanic. Like check this out. Um, and that was really incredible, especially because indie game like nowadays you can like find that stuff every single day. You just pick your gaming blog of choice, and there'll be trailers for things claiming to be innovative or whatever. Um, but we were kind of starved for content and news back then, so it was really uh, I don't know. It was just it was very inspiring. It was extremely inspiring, and the most inspiring thing of all was part of the experimental gameplay workshop was they showed the results of the indie game jam. Uh, that year, I believe, was the second ever indie game jam. Um, and the year that I went, they had or in 2003, they were showing off this shadow casting technology. It was almost like a proto Kinect type thing, but imagine a projector, and you stand in front of the projector, and of course you're standing in front of the projector, so your shadow gets cast on the screen. Um, but it does edge detection on the shadow, and so it can tell where your shadow is on the screen. And so that was how you would interact in a kind of like, you know, Kinect gestural style way with the world. Um, but this was also my introduction to the concept of game jams. In fact, at the time they were still only the only people doing game jams. Game jams were not a thing until the Indie Game Jam did it, and it was founded by Sean Barrett and Chris Hecker. The first one.
Sean Barrett, somebody he worked for like Looking Glass, right?
Yeah, Sean worked for Looking Glass, and he's also been a sort of prolific consultant, and I believe he worked at Rad Game Tools on sort of like generic game engine middleware type stuff. And similar to John Blow and also Chris Hecker, he's been kind of like a thought leader, especially in sort of he's again like John and Chris, one of these tech-focused programmer guys who also has a strong design sense and strong opinions about design. So Sean and Chris started the Indie Game Jam, and I think 2002 was the first year, '03 was the second year, and the shadow casting stuff, like, I don't know, it all kind of sucked, but like Game Jam games kind of suck, right? I mean, you spend 2 days working on a game, but also at the time there was no such thing as Unity. There were none of these. It was all custom code, and so to see the best programmers from the game industry, like, and artists too, get together in a room and spend 2 days working with a custom engine to create playable games after 48 hours. It was inconceivable at the time that you could do that just technically. And so it was just exhilarating. And some of the stuff that came out of that was actually kind of cool. The one 3D game that was made over the weekend was called, it was by Casey Muratori, who's with Molly Rocket. He does a lot of YouTube streaming these days of like complex programming problems in game development. But he also worked on The Witness as well. But I believe it was called Casey Muratori's Pro Owl. And it was a takeoff on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but you're an owl. And the way you play it is like, you're shadow casting, and you just like flap your arms like a bird to like fly. But it was like this 3D game with tricks, and like they stole a bunch of samples from the Tony Hawk games and stuff. And it was actually a really like funny parody type thing, which I just thought was great. And so I became a huge fan of the Indie Game Jam. I just idolized both the event and all the guys. And I say guys because it was like a bunch of guys and then Robin Hunicke.
Yeah.
Robin Hunicke, for listeners, probably most famous now as being the executive or the producer on Journey.
Yeah, she still runs the experimental. She's the one who runs the experimental gameplay sessions now.
Yeah, and she was a grad student back then at the University of Chicago in their AI program, actually, the computer science doing AI research.
But you got involved with the game jam stuff, didn't you? At
I
some point.
did. I did. So in 2004, I went to GDC. 2003, I went to GDC every year for 10 years after that. But in 2004, I was still a student, and I went and I saw their next game jam, which was based on the concept of what if we had a physics engine in a game, which was a new concept at the time. I mean, people had done it before, but this was before, like the first major game to come out with like doing gameplay stuff with physics was Valve's Half-Life 2, like with the gravity gun. Like that was the first time really most gamers had seen physics puzzles.
And that
But
game came out in like 2004, didn't it?
it was either late 2004 or 2005. Yeah. Um, I think it was '05 because that was the whole reason why people had to install Steam. Like
Yeah.
that was the Trojan horse for getting Steam on people's computer. If you wanted to play Half-Life, you had to install this new program called Steam, which no one really wanted to. Um, and so, but in 2004, so they had a Ottman Binstock actually, who at the time was living in Japan. I don't know what he's up to these days, but he was yet another one of these genius programmer guys, and he had coded up for the previous year's game jam a quick and dirty 2D engine. It is basically similar to what you might know as Box 2D today, which is what powers like Angry Birds, a rigid body physics engine. And so they said, okay, what if we do something with a rigid body physics engine? And so they played around with a bunch of different concepts, and there was one concept that I loved, which was called Hopper Quest, and it was this simple programmer art game with rectangles and circles, and it was made by Chris Hecker and also Austin Grossman. Austin Grossman did a bunch of writing on various games, including, I believe, Deus Ex. But he wasn't the main writer. That was Sheldon Picotti. And he's written for a ton of different games, sort of the usual game writer, like, you freelance around and do a little bit here and a little bit there. And he used to work he's an ex-Looking Glass guy as well. These days, he's more of a regular author, like books and stuff. He had a pretty popular book called Soon I Will Be Invincible, which is like a parody superhero type novel thing. Anyway, Austin and Chris did this game, Hopper Quest, and it was just this little physics sandbox thing, but I just fell in love with it. It was one of these games where you have to it's a little bit like QWOP, Bennett Foddy's QWOP, where
The popular online, it's like popular on 4chan and stuff, where you like control each limb with a different key.
yeah, exactly. And this wasn't a full person's body like it is in QWOP, so it didn't have quite that level of humor. But it was like a little sort of creature with a couple of different limbs that you independently controlled. And I just loved sort of locomoting around the environment with this little dude. Or I guess it's not really a dude. It's just the Hopper. Yeah, I shouldn't gender the Hopper. Anyway, so I just fell in love with that, and when they released all the games online, that was one of the other things that they did, which was also kind of revolutionary, was they would release the games afterwards so people could download them and play them. And and I was just overcome, and I had to, and when I was sitting at home, I decided to make a fan page for one of these, for Hopper Quest, which is just this shitty little one-off weekend game. And so I made a fan page, and I like included tips and tricks for how you might play Hopper Quest, and I made my own levels for it and posted those levels, um, and then I also created a fake clan page, like a Quake clan, but for Hopper Quest. And I wrote it in the sort of parodic style. I wrote it like I was an excited, 10-year-old or whatever, um, with bad web design skills. And I sent it to Robin Hunicke, and Robin thought it was really funny, and then sent it over to the rest of the Indie Game Jam folks, and that eventually resulted in them inviting me to be an intern at the 2005 Indie Game Jam. Um, and that was like a huge turning point for me. That was where I got to work with I got to work alongside people who I idolized for years. Um, it was great. I got to be friends with a lot of these people. Some of them I'm still friends with to this day. Um, and I was definitely starstruck. But it was almost like I got access to this exclusive club. Like looking back on it now, and people were even kind of jealous of me that it's like, oh man, you got in with with the cool kids crowd. Like, how did you do that? And I was like, I don't know. I made a crappy, funny website, But yeah, it was. So I guess I kind of got lucky. Um,
A lot of that stuff is timing.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so and so yeah, I got to work alongside those people, and they really like influenced. Their a lot of their thought influences me to this day. Like for example, I make sort of internet art stuff right now, but most of my projects I only spend a few hours working on. I'll get the idea, and then I'll try and create it as fast as I can and just get it out there, because to me something that exists and is not perfect is better than something that I just keep on the shelf and never release. And that's directly indebted to the idea of game jams. Like that is 100% like, let's just sprint, and get this thing done as quickly as possible so it's out there in the world. Um, and I'm highly indebted to Chris and Sean and all the Indie Game Jam people for encouraging that mode of creative work in me.
And that definitely had a huge influence on what quote unquote indie games would end up becoming.
Absolutely. Yeah, that combined with the experimental gameplay workshop at GDC, which is, I mean, the lines blur because everyone who ran the EGW was also an Indie Game Jam participant too. Um, so yeah, and so that kind of stuff really, both the Game Jam spirit and also just the EGW spirit, um, which was very focused on innovative mechanics, as like the sort of be all end all of games innovation.
It still kind of is.
Yeah, it's just less relevant now, but
Yeah.
as an event, but back then it was really like that was, you know, you showed something at the EGW, and like that was, you might as well have won an Oscar for indie games, right? Or maybe a Sundance award, right? Like that's
It's a yeah. I guess the difference is it's a much smaller world. So it like even in 2012, 2011 when I got involved with stuff, it was still like a much smaller world.
yeah.
Now not so much.
Yeah, and it was even smaller, in '03, '04, '05. So, yeah, yeah, it was an exciting time because everything sucked so much, but also was getting better much rapidly in terms of just, in terms of just good games getting made. The games sucked in 2003. One of my main theories around that is just that the tooling hadn't quite, like, we had fully transitioned to 3D by like 2001, 2002. There really weren't any 2D games you could buy in stores anymore. And the tooling hadn't really caught up yet. We didn't have stuff like Unity where you could just like where it's not that difficult to throw together a 3D game without that much pain. It was a very painful process, and we were still trying to wrap our heads around just the production of all the art and that kind of thing. And so it was this weird point where the raw processing power was there, and gamers, expected full 3D and all that sort of stuff, but game developers hadn't really caught up yet. Things hadn't standardized. I mean,
Well,
it wasn't even until 2003 really that what is currently considered a game engine, like your standard game engine, was really codified in the industry as like a best practice.
yeah, I think part of the thing that made indie games more popular is just the industry becoming more standardized, more like austerity approach applied, where everything is sort of like um, each pieces and part of a game is kind of like it's like a factory kind of mindset, and I feel like that set in around the mid 2000s.
Yes.
And that opened the way for people to actually make smaller things, because there wasn't really that many new ideas getting into like big budget games, and it's still kind of that way.
Yeah, there was this vacuum that needed filling. Whereas I remember, you could go to, Babbage's or something in the 90s and probably find something kind of weird and interesting. And that wasn't true in the late 90s. Like by the time 99 rolled around, it was starting to look much more like a modern GameStop, just shoot this and that.
Yeah, I mean, I was still conscious of like some of the the weirder stuff at that point, but it seemed like by the early to mid 2000s that had pretty much disappeared.
Yeah, it was a gradual process, but yeah.
But so you got involved with game stuff. You also like had this like networking guide for GDC that I remember seeing somebody that I know who like from a completely different context like linked it and said, "Oh, people should read this."
That feels like another lifetime, like I was another person back then. But yeah, I wrote. It was actually, I started writing it before I got my first job in video games. So like 2003, 2004, I went to GDC and I was still a student. And then in 2005, I was almost going to graduate from college, and I did the Indie Game Jam, and I was trying to get a job, and I couldn't find a job anywhere. I got some interviews, but no one really wanted to hire me, and I was feeling really dejected. And while I was underemployed, I think I was working for my university at that time, but while I was underemployed and wishing I had a job, I was like, well, I have this blog, because also blogging was a new thing back then too. Like it was a fairly recent phenomenon. And in early 2005 was when I started Tiny Subversions, my blog. At the time, it was a Blogspot blog. I didn't have tinysubversions.com yet. And I was, so I had this,
Was the name Tiny Subversions? Was that sort of influenced by the indie game jam kind of thing? Like
it wasn't actually, not consciously at least. Tiny Subversions was just a two-word phrase from an essay that I had written for an English class, and I liked those two words together, so I pulled them out of context and made them the title of my blog.
Because it seems very in line with that sort of thinking.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a concept that was intriguing to me generally. I mean, I'm sure if you had mentioned it back then, I would have been like, oh, yeah, I guess it does kind of match up with that. But it wasn't conscious. It wasn't like, oh, yeah, game jams. I'm going to call it Tiny Subversions. So I had this blog lying around, and I wanted to put stuff up on it, and I was like, well, what am I good at? Oh, everyone says I'm good at networking, so I will just write about how do I network? I will write a series of blog posts about it. And that was really the first like popular thing I had ever created on the internet. It's had in the last 10 years, I think it's had a cumulative like million views or something. For a while, it was being taught in like at games programs at universities, um,
Wow.
sort of thing. Yeah. And I guess I stand by the basics of it, which is, the basic thing is just like if you want to network, like don't be a dick. Your job is to like find people you think are genuinely interesting and make friends with them and like keep in touch. Like that's
Hmm.
pretty much. But also, I think that was harder to do pre-social media. Like in 2005, we didn't have Twitter. And LinkedIn was like brand new or was just about to come out, and Facebook was just brand new as well. At the time, I had a lot of stuff like, oh, write down everyone you know in a book, and then like flip through the pages of the book, and like make sure to contact people you haven't talked to in a while, and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And So that was like my first like successful, I guess, internet project thing. To the point where I even had a publisher who wanted to like transform it into a textbook for schools, and I was like, I tried for like a couple months, and then I was like, no, I can't do this.
So, when did the tide turn with games, and what sort of pushed you out of that? Because I know that you wrote that piece called "Fuck Video Games," which I like wrote a response to at the
Yeah.
time, and you were involved in the IGDA, and then you quit that, and you made a post about that, but that was like in 2013. So what happened to get you? What happened that kind of soured you on some of that stuff, and what got you into what you're doing now?
Yeah, so it was roughly so basically once I got my first job in video games, which was at Turbine Games in Boston, I worked on Dungeons and Dragons Online and Lord of the Rings Online. It's actually in the news recently because the both of those games got handed off to like the company that bought Turbine, which is Warner Brothers now. Warner Brothers is getting rid of those games and they're handing it off to like a small studio now to like sort of keep them on life support. And anyway, it's been interesting reconnecting with all my former coworkers because of that. But I worked on D&D Online, Lord of the Rings Online, and then I just went off and did my own consulting business for a few years. And that business was for analytics in games. I mean, people just take for granted now that like when you play a mobile game, they're probably recording what stuff you buy and sell, and what basic choices you take, and people know what percentage of players finish their game and that sort of thing. But no one had that at all until the early 2000s, and even then it was a very sparse thing. And so like the games, I believe I was the first person to be employed full time as a gameplay analytics person in the United States. And so I sort of took that and turned it into its own consulting and software business, and we would go around to different MMO developers and put analytics in their games, which was like a brand new concept for everyone. Um, and so I did that for a few years, and then the MMO market crashed in like 2008 when basically people decided that, oh, World of Warcraft was an aberration, not a repeatable success. Crap, we should probably stop spending tens of millions of dollars making MMOs. Um, and then Facebook games were getting hot, so I worked on Facebook games for a little while. And then I
So
started,
you were sort of following the waves.
yeah, I was following the waves. I mean, that was, especially if you live in a place like Boston, which is not a primary city for game development, you kind of have to follow the money.
Yeah. Okay.
Otherwise, there's no jobs for you. And so So I worked on Facebook games for a while, and then as I was working on Facebook games, I was working in analytics, so I was seeing the writing on the wall. I was seeing that there were like, that we were incredibly dependent on what seemed to be a small number of gambling addicts, who would spend, $10,000 a month on the game, and so the game was maybe pulling in 100 grand a month, but most of that was from like 10 or 12 people, um, who wanted to pay tens of thousands of dollars a month for fake zoo animals. Um, and it
Very
felt,
strange business model.
yeah, and I was like, I have to. This is not sustainable. I have to get out of this. At the
And
same,
also not really ethical either.
no, not it's sort of not ethically sustainable for me for sure. And so at the same time that all that was happening, this was in 2010. Um, I uh, um, I took a the first HTML5 game engines were coming out. I had played around. So, by the way, also all this time while I was working at game companies, I was also working on my own little indie game experiments, but I never managed to ship anything. I just had a bunch of, 10% finished, but never, 10% started, but never finished projects just sitting in a projects folder. Um, and I was working with whatever engine was hot at the time. So, Torque engine for a while, and then I tried making stuff in Flash for a while, and I just nothing ever clicked for me. um, but the first HTML5 game engine started coming out in 2010, and it was still a very experimental technology. But in 2010, this engine came out. It was called Akihabara, like the place in Tokyo. Um, and it could do like sort of NES level games. Um, and I started playing around with it, and it was my first time doing JavaScript, really. So any kind of web browser programming, I had poked at it before, but never really dived in. And and so that was my first time working on an open source project, and I ended up writing all the documentation for the game engine, and also ended up rewriting a fair amount of the game engine as well. It was really my first time doing a big programming project, and the work that I did in that, I ended up getting a job offer from a company in Boston that was a JavaScript developer, but they wanted to start doing games type work, and they knew I was local and had experience, and there were probably only like 20 people worldwide who could claim experience in HTML5 game development in 2010. So they hired me on to do games work there. So I was sort of like the games industry guy coming into a web development company to sort of teach them things about game development. And in turn, they taught me things about web development. And I ended up working there for 3 years. And over time...
Could you repeat that? The intern, they taught you things about web development? Is that
Yeah.
what you said?
Yes. I taught them things about game development, and in turn, they taught me things about web development.
Okay, cool.
And over time, I started doing less and less game stuff and more just general web stuff. And by which I mean in terms of just my creative hobbies. I discovered that the web browser was a really great way to have people interact with stuff. I love that you didn't have to download anything. It was just people could just go to a website and experience an interactive thing. And to me, it was just really ripe for creative exploration. I sort of fell in love with a number of sort of like word generation technologies, like natural language processing type stuff, playing with text, but also just playing with, for a while I was really interested in the idea of, instead of having like a Flash game that just sits in a frame on your web browser, the game is now part of the whole browser experience. So what if your your game didn't just sit in a frame? What if it broke the frame and started messing with other things on the web page? And I don't think I ended up doing too much with that, but the idea of like hooking into the fundamentally what's going on with the web browser and just messing with that experience was fascinating to me, and that was really my entry into what I would broadly call internet art now.
So you were also involved, like in the. I mentioned the IGDA
Oh,
and
yes,
stuff, and then you wrote like "fuck video games." So
that's right.
what brought you to that?
Uh,
What brought you to like being like, okay, I'm not gonna go to GDC anymore. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm gonna go off and do my internet art thing now.
Yeah, so IGDA is almost kind of a side thing to this story. I was on the board of directors for that from 2010 to 2013 or 2012, I forget, but it was like 3 years starting 2010 or 2009, and and I ended up, I learned a lot. I was young at the time. I learned a lot about being on the board of an international trade association thing. I have a lot I could say, but suffice to say, it did sour me a little bit. The thing it soured me most on was I realized that I was getting a false sense of what the game industry was like by going to game industry events, because
Mm-hmm.
because that was all people who self-selected to go to those events, right? It was, of course, most of the people, excuse me, of course, most of the people who go to GDC are excited about moving the industry forward because they wouldn't be at GDC if they weren't, unless they were trying to sell something.
Yeah.
Um, but you go to a game studio and you talk to your rank and file developer, and a lot of the times it's just some dude who like wants to make an awesome gun and then go home. Like that's
Yeah.
uh, and it's a job. It's a job, and like it's a kind of an interesting job, but it's still like, well, we're gonna put bigger boobs on the love interest this time around because that seemed to sell last year. you know. And it's not even like that's not even like the out of touch corporate executives. That's like your rank and file designers coming up with those decisions.
Yeah.
Um, so uh, so that's so that was sort of disillusioning to me. And at the same time, I had grown frustrated with the fact that excuse me, I had grown frustrated with the fact that I had never finished any of these indie games that I had made, but also I was enamored of the fact that like all this web stuff that I was building was feeling really good to me. I was building stuff that I liked, and also other people liked it. Um, and I had, and I was also reading deep in a lot of like media theory stuff at the time too. Um, and and I was just like, well, maybe video games isn't my medium. Like what and then I started thinking about it, and that just got me to this place of like, yeah, fuck video games. Maybe it's not necessarily um, the medium of most of the people that I know who struggle with it. I mean, clearly it works for some people,
Yeah.
but maybe it doesn't work for everyone, and maybe that's okay. Um,
The idea of video games in itself is kind of a construction. We assume that something is a video game because of some agreed upon rules, but it's really just another piece of software.
exactly. It is just all software because it's like, is Myst a video game? Well, it is because it was sold as one, but it's also it was just created in HyperCard, and HyperCard, like most stuff created in HyperCard, is not considered a video game.
Yeah.
It's more like it was HyperCard in the '90s was like Twine today, right? It's like point and click kind of manipulate a hypertext document type thing. Um, and so, yeah, what?
But there was also the sorry,
No,
continue
no.
actually.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's just so what made Myst a video game, but something else in HyperCard, not a video game. I guess Myst had really fancy 3D rendering, and people see 3D rendering and they think video games.
Yeah, the 3D thing was really big at that time. It was good timing, I think. Um, I I mean there was also the I think around that time, like late 2000s, early like 2010, 2011, 2012, you have a lot of more people who are kind of either academics or ex-game industry people, or people still working in the industry, like theorists, and a lot of people being like, we need to improve video games. They need to branch out artistically. Like all this stuff, the medium needs to move forward. And there's all these pressures to kind of integrate all this stuff that was before, and carry all this baggage that comes from video games, that they have to be action oriented, or they have to work a certain way, or you have to interact with them in a certain way. And a lot of those people aren't necessarily always open to things that are actually expanding that medium, because they're not necessarily considered video
Right,
games.
they're still invested in that concept. It's
Yeah.
interesting you mentioned the timeline because yeah, people were saying that in 2010, but you know, also Chris Crawford, who founded the Game Developers Conference, was saying that in 1988.
Yeah.
Like it's, like you can go back and read some of the stuff that Chris wrote in the 80s, and he's like, games don't just have to be about shooting. They could be about like conversations between people and like, rich simulations and, and this and this and that. I mean, it's not 100% like a mod, doesn't read 100% modern, but it's still the same idea, and it's
Well,
essentially the same arguments being made back then too.
yeah. Well, and now, like in the 90s, there was CD-ROM software, there was interactive
Hmm.
software that wasn't necessarily considered games.
Right.
And now we have like VR stuff,
Yeah.
that's not, like different people who are coming from a more like arts background are getting involved with that, like they did with the CD-ROM stuff, and that's not necessarily considered games either.
Right.
But it is like part of the same thing, and they don't necessarily have to be the same thing. Like they don't, like I think some people want it to come all under the umbrella of games, because they want games cultural image to be improved. um, but that's the problem, that I feel like it's always an image thing, like because making software on the internet, or making any kind of software, any kind of like digital art, there are always intersections between different media into each other, and the barriers are much more hazy than they are with other mediums. um, and so the barriers, like, are kind of artificial. Like we invent them, and we put a lot of stock in them. Um, and I don't know. I mean, that's part of the theme of this podcast, is getting beyond that.
Right.
um, but but yeah, I think, like, I mean, that's been my frustrating thing. I've kind of sort of stuck around in games in spite of saying that I'm leaving it. Just because this idea that you have to pledge yourself to forwarding the medium and do all these incredibly self-destructive things, like work in the industry and work overtime, and work
Right.
insane hours, and deal with like horribly entitled fans, like, and like, just feed all this stuff, like, all those expectations are there. It's kind of like a weird self-flagellating thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
I would, I mean,
yeah.
if I had a game idea and I thought it was best suited to a game, I would make a game. Like I haven't, I haven't, I said fuck video games and I haven't done much in games since, but I made a game last year for Stephen Colbert, and it was a Bernie Sanders like funny parody game thing, and it was contract work, but like, I'm not gonna not make games. I'm not allergic to it or anything. Um, but it's not like my default. I don't like my thought process used to be, oh, I just read this fascinating book on architecture. How can I put that in a game?
Yeah, well, you're always trying to find ways to. I mean, there's one aspect which is like translation, and obviously, like any kind of medium that you're working in, you need to translate the idea in a way that works. But in another way, it's like it's always like I see this a lot where people have an idea, they have an inspiration from another piece of media or whatever, and they're like, how do I make this into a game mechanic? And I think that is the moment most of the time where they've lost,
Yeah.
like where it's like you might as well give up because like it's gonna reduce it's just going to become it's the same narrative. It's going to become the same thing. It's just you're using a different like you're dressing it up with a different idea, but it's still you're still playing out the same sort of fantasies or ideas. And I think that's the thing that's been the hardest to get people to wrap their brains around who are involved in games, that how invested people are in this particular idea, to just give some of that up or at least admit that that exists, you know. And I don't know, that's been one of my biggest points of frustration. It's not just like, you know, I read like uh, Bjork talking about video games and saying like, you know, why are video games so violent? Like I never understand that world and stuff. And I agree with that, but it's not just about violence for me. It's also it's about like this sort of empowered narrative and the sort of forms and progressions that things are supposed to take.
Yeah.
Um, and like they never I mean, and there's stuff that doesn't fit into that format, but like we limit ourselves so much by trying to draw those like artificial barriers between things. But I guess those artificial barriers are what cause people to become financially successful. So there's that kind of weird conflict there.
Yeah, and I mean barriers can be helpful at times too. I don't know about the kind of barriers that we're talking about in particular, but it can help to like,
Well, I mean barriers between video games and other like
oh yeah,
bots or things that you do, like
right.
the Twitter bots or the pieces of digital media. I mean, Twitter is a game. Like it's entirely designed. It's false kind of manufactured interactions with it. Not. It's a somebody had an idea of what kind of experience that they wanted to make, and they made it, and we're all sort of participating in it. But I think because it's become so normalized, we don't see it as actually it's just somebody's idea
Right.
of how to interact with each other,
Right.
and
We
that's
definitely
like
we
that's
definitely
how
get
tech works.
yeah, we definitely get scored on everything we say on Twitter. You know, that's what those like faves and retweets are about.
And
Um,
it's a totally gamified idea of reality.
mhm. Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I think we don't understand how much we're these things that we're participating in our games, and even people in the tech world have this kind of sense of like moral superiority or like invulnerability or something, where they believe that they have chosen the objectively best ideas,
Right.
and just because something has gotten popular or whatever, or it's become more universal, and there are very few people out there who are involved with that, who are willing to accept the idea that this is all just somebody's idea, and they're carrying all their sort of cultural and other baggage into these ideas.
Right. Well, and I mean that's just a general human problem as well, not just in uh, like I think about, you know, like to use a classic example, money, right, and currency, and interest, right? Like, well, of course, money when you put it in a bank earns interest. Why? Because we decided that that's what it does, you know, like, and we had reasons for deciding that, but just like the Twitter, engineers and designers had reasons for designing what, doing what they did too. But it's still, there have been, you can, just like you can find social networks that don't operate like Twitter, you can look at the historical record and find money with things that have essentially reverse interest, where, if you store money somewhere, it loses value over time, Right.
I guess the difference that I perceive with the internet is at least things for a while were theoretically on the same level. Like you could type in twitter.com and you would get that experience, but then you might type in twitting.com or something like that. And it could just be like some like fucked up version of Twitter.
Right.
You know, and like that still exists to some extent. I mean, that's like the whole thing with net neutrality though. But like we theoretically have net neutrality, but we don't actually anyway, because everyone's attentions are like funneled towards Facebook or Twitter or whatever, YouTube, all those places. But as somebody who grew up going on the computer and like designing websites and everything, I mean, I didn't do anything super intensive, but like it's obvious to me how much this is just another program. This is just another thing that somebody created, because almost anyone can do it. And that's what kind of makes it even stranger to say, like, for me to say, like, why should we accept this one thing but not accept these other ideas? If theoretically someone could make this idea, someone, a random person could make this other idea, and could actually implement it. Like, you can't make your own. I mean, people have tried to make their own currency. They've tried to do Bitcoin and stuff, but like, you can't easily make your own currency and do a lot of that stuff, but you can make your own social media platform or whatever. And I guess that's the difference, and that kind of exposes to me how much we sort of enter into these kind of collective fantasies without really knowing that we're doing that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's. I think that's a good point. I mean, and so much of it has to do with essentially just popularity and network effects. A social network is not necessarily of use to me unless there's people who I want to talk to on it, or at least people who I want to be able to see my stuff on it. And so you do end up with these. I mean, they're systems. Just like in games, there are positive feedback loops where, well, Twitter has a lot of people on it, so it's going to keep having a lot of people on it because people want to go where the people are.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can segue from talking about that into talking about your Twitter bots, and that being a realm that you got really involved in. Now, I find a lot of that stuff interesting because it is trying. I see it as trying to do some of the stuff that, quote unquote net art did in the past, is taking this like corporatized internet experience and trying to skew it, or like introduce something bizarre and kind of unpredictable, or like that kind of goes against what the intention of this platform was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it is just about like weird, to at the risk of using a played out term, like keeping the internet weird. Like just like I remember being 13 years old and being on the internet for the first time, really, like the World Wide Web for the first time. And just how weird and strange it was. And like, it was very, I remember like reading reptilian conspiracy theory websites, when
that stuff has become even more mainstream, honestly.
Yeah. But and at the time it was just like, holy crap, what is this? This is so strange.
Yeah.
And I would read that kind of stuff, and there was all this just weird, amazing stuff out there. And also you would experience, you would have things like spam, right? Spam mail. And these days we don't have as big a problem with spam as we did, 10 or more years ago, because we have better filters for the most part. But back then I remember having to constantly delete lots and lots of spam. But sometimes the spam was beautiful and it was poetic and it was like this weird encounter. And sometimes I would just forward spam to my friends because I would get a particularly funny, word salad in the mail. And I just remember those feelings, and a lot of this is what I do with bots is just trying to like recapture what I liked about the internet before, where it was just, it was this weird alien encounter. And I specifically started making Twitter bots in particular because I thought Twitter was a great place to confront people with alien entities. It was relatively easy to program a Twitter bot, still is. Um, Also, the 140 characters and just something about Twitter just flattens entities so that the difference between, it's not like a video call where the difference between a person and a bot is going to be readily apparent. I just like that it's a level playing field for all sorts of different actors, and so a a bot that tweets, whenever it detects an earthquake in the area in the region of San Francisco Bay, might be just as important to somebody as their friend's Twitter account. But mechanically, they're the same thing on Twitter. You're still just following and reading and maybe interacting. So that's what was really interesting to me about Twitter as a platform generally. And I was very specifically setting out to make. I read Ian Bogost, who's another one of these programmer/theorist folks, also loosely affiliated with some of those Indie Game Jam folks, although he never attended an Indie Game Jam, to my knowledge. I met him back when at my first or second GDC, and we've known each other for 10 years. And 10 years later, I was reading his philosophy book called Alien Phenomenology that he had written, and that's what really got me to making Twitter bots. Was he had a provocation in there that was sort of a call to create alien entities, perhaps with software that did philosophical labor. And so my first Twitter bots were definitely built as like my concept of them. And I don't know if I have that conception still, but my concept at the time was they were these never-ending philosophical laborers.
That's interesting. I mean, we all are sort of laborers, on social media.
Yeah.
Like I think about, I make money through Patreon and everything, and I think about like I'm not doing, enough. Like I'm not working on projects that really feel fulfilling enough. And then I think about like I'm tweeting all the time, and that is like a weird. It's supposed to be pleasure, but it has become a weird form of work.
Yeah, I did just recently take a break from Twitter, and I hate to be that guy, but it's kind of great. It's it was definitely necessary for me. Like I'm not prescribing it as everything that everyone should do, but I was I don't know, I was just finding Twitter stressful. So clearly, not being on Twitter has been removed that stress from my life. Now, of course, I don't have a Patreon, so it's not like my livelihood is not quite as tied to my internet presence. Um, but yeah, it's been liberating to not have to do that labor, and I've somewhat filled it in with other social networks, which is six of one, half dozen of the other. But it's also freed up a lot of time for me to just do other things too, like just hang out in a library and roam through the stacks and grab random books and that kind of thing, which is just a very relaxing activity for me in a way that being on Twitter is not.
Yeah. I guess like I feel both ways about it because I feel like people both with the internet and video games, there's this kind of fear of like internet weirdness, or this fear of this kind of like abstraction or kind of bizarre things that the internet and video games have introduced um, in like sort of mainstream culture and mainstream society. And I think it's why some of that stuff has been so dismissed, and it's also why it's become a real place where fringe elements grow, um, because it kind of represents something that is sort of against the traditionally acceptable ideas of what a thing should or shouldn't be, I guess.
Right.
That has manifested itself in both really interesting and really terrible ways. Um, but I like, I guess that's why I can't really divorce myself or things that I've done from the internet, because it really is like, I mean, when I got involved with indie games, and just the internet in general, like it felt like, as a kid, it felt kind of like the Wild West or whatever. Like you're going out and you're finding your own territory. You're finding your own dream and like trying to make that. And it feels much less like that now,
Mm-hmm.
because it feels like everything is much more codified. And like the actual Wild West, like some people got really successful and a bunch of other people got fucked over.
Right.
Um, but I mean, and the fact that I literally moved from Ohio to California to get
Right.
involved with stuff is it's to the Bay Area specifically.
Yeah. Yeah. You're
Um,
panning for gold.
yeah, exactly. And I did not get very much. um, but um, but I don't know, like what outlets do we have otherwise, and that's kind of what I end up coming back to, and why I feel like I can't, regardless of anything else, like traditional media might not really understand weird internet, and might not really understand games or whatever, but from what I've heard anyway, like video game let's players are huge. That's the biggest thing on YouTube.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, like being a game developer is, I've heard this, I don't know if it's true, is like the number one thing that kids now say that they want to do
Yeah,
when they grow
I've
up.
seen that too. It's like astronaut used to be in the 60s and 70s or something.
Yeah. Well, and yeah. And like, it's like actor or comedian, or there are a lot of like uh but I don't know, like that's a real, like, I mean, it's becoming a really important part of culture and society, and it's kind of sad that it's so controlled and mediated by some of these like uh, fringe elements, and there's so it hasn't really found a way to sort of sustain itself and create a conversation that isn't um, that it kind of exists outside of this like ultra capitalist kind of austerity, like libertarian sort of thinking that dominates both tech and games. But
I mean
I
that
guess, like,
that's why
yeah, go
that's
ahead.
why I really encourage amateurs to be amateurs. I think there's something to be said for doing stuff on the side. Like my job for 10 years almost was video game development, but the job part was always a job. It wasn't the passion projects, right? The passion projects were still those indie games I tried to make on the side. Um, and then when I was working as a web developer, I was doing creative web stuff on the side as well, but that wasn't my day job either. Now it kind of is my job, where my spouse and I have Field Train, which is our creative technology cooperative. So we're doing like bots and things like that. But even then, I still have all my work on the side. And I just I think there's something fundamental changes when you start doing things explicitly for money, even if it's not at the bidding of someone else, but you're like, okay, I'm going to do this, and the point of this is if it's popular enough, I'm going to get some money, or
Yeah,
and that does change things a lot. And for some people,
it kind of ruins
it
everything.
does kind of ruin everything. And when people ask me, oh, I want to be a video game developer, I was like, awesome. How do you feel about hating video games for the rest of your life? And if they're horrified, then I'm like, well, maybe don't be a game developer because you're gonna hate video. Like it was really only the last 2 years after I had not been a game developer for 3 or 4 years that I started really enjoying games again. Like
Yeah.
this year especially has been a great year for me, just really having a great time with games, and it's because partly because I don't make them anymore, but also I don't really participate in the online discourse about it anymore either.
I mean, that's the thing that that always infuriates me. I've tried to dive into the discourse and always come up like feeling frustrated and disappointed, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I tried, but it's
Yeah.
it's been incredibly frustrating. Like I don't feel like I'm necessarily the greatest writer in the world or anything. Like I feel like there's some stuff that I've done that's written pretty well, but like to feel like I'm the only one talking about certain things, or I'm one of like two or three people who's like at all trying to do this certain thing, like talk about video games or talk about that culture in a particular way, is so tremendously sad to me.
Well, I think that's a failure of the internet too. Like I would be shocked if I bet there's other people out there doing it too, but
Yeah, they're probably just
it's
part of a different
it's on some
sub-community.
private forum somewhere or whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
just some community that we are not connected to.
Yeah, that's true. I've noticed it more and more. Like I wrote about video games and digital media and all that stuff from what I guess I understand now as being kind of a leftist perspective, but I didn't really understand how to connect a lot of the dots until I started reading more explicitly like leftist, Marxist, whatever
Yeah.
kind of literature, and now I feel like, oh wow, I really I
Yeah.
really actually need to read more about this stuff because but like I at the time when I was writing, I was like it seemed so unusual for someone to care about the issues that marginalized people face, but also care about but also prioritize like things, there being an equal playing field, and things not being things being fair, and things being like economically, like things
Right.
being accessible, and those two things were at odds with each other
Yeah.
in like, and like it seems so bizarre that they've that's how things have been, but yeah, I don't know, like I forgot what I was gonna
Oh,
say.
that's okay. I do have to wrap up and head out in a few minutes.
Okay.
Uh,
Do you want to talk about just what some of your favorite bots or other things that you've done are, and I can maybe put a link to them in the.
yeah, I mean, like favorite bots that anyone's made or just my stuff? Like,
Well, both, I
yeah,
guess.
I mean, favorite bots. One of my favorite bots ever is called Census Americans, and it's a bot that goes. It's by Jia Zhang, and it goes through the U.S. Census records, and it pulls out data that is representative of individual people. It's like self-consistent and all that, and it just tweets a little story like. I am retired. I am a war veteran. I am disabled. I am divorced. I have been married twice. Like that's um, and it's very poetic. I don't know. It's very evocative just using this very bland census data, but it manages to pull some very create some very evocative narratives in my head just with this very spare language. Um,
Oh, what's that hypercard thing that you worked on real quickly?
oh
We
yeah,
didn't get a
yeah, yeah.
chance to talk about that.
This was so there was an interactive novel, a hypercard based novel made for the Mac back in 90, I want to say 95, 96, called Uncle Buddy's Phantom Funhouse, and it's by John McDade. And it was this just incredible. I mean, again, for people who might not be familiar with HyperCard, if you are familiar with Twine, it's sort of similar to that. It's this just like hypertext, like novel sort of experience with a lot of images, also very heavily image based. And I was asked by Rutgers University to join a panel of artists who got to reinterpret the work because it was its 20th anniversary. And so I went in, and of all the people who were on it, I was the one programmer. So I went in and actually got the source code from John McDade himself, and went into HyperCard in an emulator and like looked at the source, what it was doing, and pulled out stuff that I thought was interesting. And I eventually managed to pull there's a tarot deck at the center of the whole thing. This weird tarot deck filled with poetry. And I made a Twitter bot out of it called Phantom Funhouse on Twitter. It's just at Phantom Funhouse is the handle. And it's just a little window into one tiny part of what I feel like is one of the greatest novels I've ever read in my life. I eventually hope to work with John to maybe bring the whole novel back so that people can read it, because I think it's a fantastic work of art, but also HyperCard is just not runnable on modern machines in any way. So that was just wonderful. That was this experience where I don't know, like a fair number of people follow the bot now, and I think it's because the aesthetic of this HyperCard thing it's just so in line with like what you see on Tumblr now or whatever. It just feels fresh, and it feels of the moment. I think partly because it was just so, ahead of its time when it came out.
That feels like the kind of thing, like people are always like, where's the like Gravity's Rainbow, or the whatever of and like it's in these communities, it's in HyperCard stuff, it's in like a random Doom mod, it's in like it's just in random places on the internet. And that's what I've discovered for being on the internet, like really great sort of transformative artworks. Like the amount of them isn't necessarily like super high, but they exist and they're out there, and a lot of people don't know about them.
And I really hope we manage to excavate and bring to the public as many of them as possible.
So is there, or just quickly, any other bots that you did? I like, one bot that I like is the glitch logos.
That's right.
Partly because on my website I have like glitched versions of like social media logos as a link to my profile, just because I like messing up corporate logos, but that's one that I like.
Yeah, messing up corporate logos is great. Glitch logos is good for that. It's one of my few very visual bots. Another visual bot that I have that people like is called Reverse OCR. It's I take a character recognition, like a handwriting recognition algorithm, and I just squiggle, I scribble with a simple drawing program until it thinks it recognizes a letter, and then I build words out of it, and it just looks like a demented child's handwriting or something, like an alien learning to write English, but not really quite understanding what a letter R is supposed to be. So I think Reverse OCR is also one worth checking out too.
Cool. So is there anything else you wanted to mention or talk about before we go?
I just want to say fuck video games.
That's really become your thing.
That's my catchphrase. It's my catchphrase. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thanks for coming on. It was really great to talk to you. Okay. I've been talking to Darius Kazemi, bot maker, former video game person who now says fuck video games. I'll put a link to everything, or most things that you mentioned, in the description. And thanks again.
Okay, thanks, Liz.
Okay. Bye.